Putin has arrived in Kazakhstan for a 2-day state visit. Unfortunately, Kazakhstan did not sign the Rome Statute, so the dictator may well visit this country without any problems. It is reported that Putin and Tokayev discussed the development of strategic partnership and alliance between Russia and Kazakhstan. Igor Alexandrovich, why does Putin at such a difficult time for Russia? He left his citizens and went to another country. Did he go to save them? I think that Putin's physical presence in Russia changes little and hardly helps. It is important to strengthen ties with neighbors, and this visit is certainly aimed at keeping Kazakhstan in Russia's orbit of influence. But Putin's physical presence does not solve much, so it is hardly possible to say that without him, everything will fall apart. Putin is not a man who can add anything useful to a country's leadership. This visit is perhaps indicative of the Kremlin's attempt to strengthen its position in Central Asia. How do you assess Kazakhstan's possible cooperation with Russia under the current circumstances? I think the main thing for Putin is to make sure that the Central Asian countries do not move further away from Russia. Russia has a huge common border with Kazakhstan, and this guarantees that Kazakhstan will not go anywhere. As for other countries, especially when it comes to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the guarantee that they will remain in Russia's orbit lies in the fact that both countries are world record holders in terms of the share of remittances from labor migrants in the GDP structure. In Tajikistan, 40% of GDP is remittances, in Kyrgyzstan 30%, so they are not going anywhere. Putin's position is still quite strong. Could Putin consider Kazakhstan as an alternative route for gas supplies, especially since supplies to Europe are now very complicated? Perhaps they will discuss this as well. But once again, the main partners in oil and gas are India and China, so it is unlikely that Kazakhstan will play a significant role in this plan. By the way, Kazakhstan has recently demonstrated a certain distance from Moscow. Can Putin try to bring back this cooperation to restore friendship with this country? Yes, that's what we're talking about now, an attempt to strengthen his position and prevent Kazakhstan from distancing itself. It is very important for Tokayev to keep his distance from Putin, but he understands perfectly well that it is not beneficial to quarrel with him, because having such a dangerous neighbor is a risk. It is known that Russia's top military and political leadership has always had an appetite for Kazakhstan, and in order not to become the next after Ukraine, it is important for Tokayev to maintain good relations with Putin. I started our conversation by saying that these are very difficult times for Russia, and Putin has essentially fled the country at this time.
По отношению к Путину, хотя Токаев, несомненно, в общем-то, прекрасно понимает, что ему ссориться с Путиным не с руки, потому что в любом случае иметь такого опасного соседа, известно, что у высшем военном и политическом руководстве России всегда существовали в том числе и аппетиты в отношении Казахстана. Поэтому не быть следующим после Украины – это очень важная задача для Токаева.
Поэтому сейчас Путин и Токаев рисуют какие-то там мостики дружбы, поэтому нужно дружить с Путиным, чтобы он не нападал на Казахстан. Я наш разговор начинала как раз с того, что сейчас очень сложные времена в России, и Путин как раз в этом...
In Russia, the ruble continues to fall and is breaking new lows due to geopolitical tensions, the latest package of sanctions, and problems paying for exports and imports.
Последнего пакета санкций и проблем с оплатой за экспорт и импорт.
Until a few hours ago, media in the Russian Federation were reporting the ruble would fall to 108 per dollar from March 2022. And now the exchange rate has reached 113. Today it was even 114, and the euro exceeded 120 rubles. If things continue to develop at the rate they are now, what is in store for Russia? Indirectly, it indicates some inflation. I don't think there will be a catastrophe because, in fact, the dollar exchange rate only indirectly reflects the characteristics of the economy. In this sense, I was very amused by Finance Minister Siluanov's statement, even though it was about the discount rate. He said that you should not pay attention to the discount rate. The more you think about it, the worse it is. You should think about good things, and everything will be fine. That is, to look at the figures in the exchangers. I think it doesn't matter much to Russians, because, in general, the vast majority of them have never seen these dollars and don't know what they are. So I think it doesn't have much of an impact, although, of course, the price level, which has roughly doubled over the period of this war, has a much greater impact. This is something that seriously affects the standard of living of Russians. Prices in stores, it's a disaster. The standard of living of Russians, the prices in the stores are a disaster, and the fact that prices are going up and wages are not, this is significant. These scissors, they are significantly cutting the standard of living of Russian citizens, at least the majority of them, those who do not work, say, in military factories, and are not, so to speak, not receiving this crazy money from the contract. The bulk of Russians have certainly become much worse off during the war. Russians may never have seen those dollars, but they still have an impact on the Russian economy. At least Russian experts and economists talk about it a lot. All of this is tied to currency, and the ruble began to fall after November 21st, when the U.S. imposed sanctions on several Russian banks linked to the global financial system, and Gazprom Bank was among them, which handles payments for Russian gas. EU ambassadors were also meeting today to discuss sanctions against Russian Federation's shadow fleet. How long do you think the Russian economy will be able to withstand such pressure if we now see that Biden is ready for sanctions lately and the UK is ready for powerful sanctions? What's next? You know, economists are divided in their opinions. I still think that the sanctions are certainly hitting. We see the dollar exchange rate going up, but on the whole, the Russian economy is still holding up. And I think that Putin will be able to continue this war for an indefinite period of time. I have a strong belief that it is not sanctions that will make Putin stop the war. If we look purely at economics, Putin will be able to continue the war for a long time, say a few years. That's not the factor that will make him stop. I think other factors will come into play sooner. Perhaps a heavy military defeat or some internal problems related to rebellion of the elites and so on.
И это не тот параметр, который, вот именно санкции, это не тот фактор, который заставит Путина прекратить войну. Я думаю, что все-таки другие факторы раньше скажутся. Там тяжелое военное поражение,
But definitely not sanctions. Sanctions are only an indirect impact on the economy, not a decisive one. As for the revolt of elites and division of Russia's resources, the protracted war is just an explanation to Russians why the country fell apart.
Про бунт элит и то, что может развалить Путина. Наши зрители пишут вопросы, и вот Александр сейчас в чате спрашивает у вас, Игорь Александрович, чи возможна версия, что окружение Путина хочет разделить между собой ресурсы России, а затяжная война — это просто разъяснение россиянам, почему страна развалилась?
You know, it is unlikely that such a situation exists at the moment. It's just that 24 years of total cleansing of the political field have led to the fact that the elites have undergone that negative selection when there are no people in these elites capable of decisive action. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that the sentiments that Alexander is talking about will be a factor in changing the situation. In general, these elites are afraid, well, the very elites that we call the top, because the elite are the best, but the worst are in power in Russia. And I think that today, they are much more afraid of Putin than of the consequences of the war. Most likely, the possibility of some kind of action will arise when the circumstances for this top Russian power will be very alarming, when a real threat of physical destruction will loom over them. For example, as a result of
возникнет тогда, когда обстоятельства для вот этой верхушки российской власти окажутся очень тревожными, когда над ними нависнет реальная угроза физического уничтожения.
A change in the situation at the front. I think that still, Anastasia, we are discussing what is happening in the economy, what is happening in finance, the dollar exchange rate, and so on. I think that these are all second-level factors, and the main thing is what is happening on the front. After all, the main events take place at the front, and it is what happens on the battlefield, on the front line, and near it that creates a situation that can change something. I am firmly convinced that in the current situation, it is on the battlefield that the fate of both Ukraine and Russia is being decided.
Именно на поле боя решается судьба и Украины, и России.
I basically agree with you that it is the Ukrainian armed forces that can influence the situation with Russia and Putin and what will happen to him next. But I also wonder what the Russians themselves will do. You and I have already discussed the economy, and you say that Russians see the prices in the stores, inflation is rising, that this depresses many people, and that salaries are not going up. But there has to be a limit. Are they ready to live in poverty? Are they ready to bury their loved ones without protesting and expressing their discontent on social networks? Of course, some people write messages on social networks, and some of them end up in jail for it.
Все-таки твердо хочу, здесь у меня есть твердое убеждение в том, что никакое ухудшение жизни не станет фактором массового какого-то.
I am still firmly convinced that no deterioration in life will be a factor of mass protest that will be able to change the situation. The means of suppression, the means of violence created by Putin's regime are such that any protest will be crushed, and people understand this very well. There are several circumstances that, from my point of view, exclude the possibility of changing the situation through some kind of uprising of citizens. First, these are the suppression forces, primarily the Rosgvardia, which in terms of numbers and force potential, is little inferior to the occupation army now fighting in Ukraine. The second circumstance is a complete, total political sweep.
Зачистка политическая, то есть в России нет никакой политической силы, которая может
That is,
возглавить
there is no
этот
political force in
протест.
Russia that could lead
Ну
this
и,
protest.
наконец,
And finally, the intimidation of the population. For a number of years, targeted repression has made people resign themselves to the idea that it is useless to revolt.
Смиряться с тем, что, так сказать, бунтовать бесполезно. Так что я думаю, что опция какого-то народного возмущения массового, которое способно изменить ситуацию, с моей точки зрения...
So I think that the option of some kind of popular outrage, a mass protest movement capable of changing the situation, is, from my point of view, completely ruled out. Friends, write in the comments, do you think the deterioration of life can affect Russians and make them protest against Putin? If someone from Russia is watching us, share what your prices are in stores. There is also discussion here that Putin may flee to Kazakhstan, like Gorbachev and Lushkov did. What do you think about this? Is such a scenario possible in which Putin would be forced to leave Russia?
Что вы думаете об этом? Возможен ли сценарий развития событий, при котором Путин действительно будет
What has to happen for that to happen?
уйти из России, и что должно произойти?
I think this scenario is, well, let's just say it's not that unlikely. It's just completely improbable. Because Putin understands perfectly well that the number of crimes he has committed is enough to be found anywhere in the world, so he has nowhere to run.
Вполне достаточно для того, чтобы его нашли в любой точке земного шара.
In general, there is no need, because Putin's position is quite stable at the moment and in the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, there are no threats to him now.
К огромному сожалению, никаких угроз для него сейчас нет. Ну, давайте просто разберем, так сказать, варианты.
Let's look at what could threaten him. We talked about a popular revolt. The probability of that is 0.
Народного бунта, народного восстания.
And I'm convinced of that.
Здесь я думаю, что, по крайней мере, я в этом убежден. Второй вариант —
The second option is a scenario in which some country, there are very few of them, literally on the fingers of one hand, decides to eliminate terrorist number one. This is a perfectly normal, legitimate decision.
О ликвидации террориста номер один. Это вполне нормальное, законное решение. Путин является законной целью для...
Putin is a legitimate target for the armed forces of Ukraine, for the special services of Ukraine, but so far I think this probability is also very close to 0. At least such actions, that is, the physical destruction of Putin as an international criminal, as terrorist number one, can be carried out by the United States of America or by the special services of Ukraine.
Но пока я не исключаю, кстати говоря, что подобного рода консультации где-то спецслужбы...
But so far, I do not rule out, by the way, that this kind of consultation is taking place somewhere, and I'm even sure that it is taking place somewhere. But no such decision has been made yet. What else? A conspiracy? A conspiracy of the top? The top is also intimidated. Although, in principle, I think that Putin has this scenario in mind and is making every effort to strengthen his security. To summarize our brief review of the scenarios, I think that at the moment, Putin is confident of his security, and although he is taking measures to preserve his life, he still has nowhere and no reason to run. And the decision to eliminate Putin has to come from Western countries, from the United States of America. Or, in fact, if Ukraine gets its ballistic missiles that will be capable of destroying bunkers and so forth.
По сути, если Украина будет иметь, я уверена, что будет иметь свои баллистические ракеты, которые там способны пробивать...
We're not even going to ask anyone about it.
Мы даже не будем ни у кого об этом спрашивать.
I think that Ukraine, in general, in principle, in our conversations with you, we have already touched on this topic, will in fact inevitably begin to drift towards a large Eastern European Israel. That is, a country that makes its own decision on how to preserve its existence, to protect itself.
Принимает решение о том, каким образом сохранить свое существование.
And this means, among other things, that just as Israel destroys its enemies personally without asking anyone about it, destroys Hamas leaders, Hezbollah leaders, Iranian generals who threaten Israel's security, Israel does not ask anyone about it.
Иранских генералов, которые угрожают безопасности Израиля. Израиль никого об этом не спрашивает. И, возможно, даже действует вопреки рекомендациям своего ближайшего союзника.
Perhaps even acting against the recommendations of its closest ally, the United States of America. I am convinced that Ukraine is moving in the same direction because, yes, it is great to have help, and Ukraine is now very dependent on help from the United States, the West, Great Britain, other countries, but still I think that in any case, Ukraine will move in a direction where it will ask less and less what it should do, including actions such as physically eliminating terrorist number one. I think it is possible, and Ukraine will do it itself as soon as the necessary conditions arise. And as for how the outside world will look at it, Israel doesn't care about it. And I think that Ukraine won't care about it either at some point, because the elimination of the number one terrorist, Vladimir Putin, I think, will radically change the situation, and after his elimination, the war will simply stop. And that's the main thing that Ukraine needs right now for a normal life. We'll talk right now and discuss. Rostislav Mirzagulov, writer, publicist, public figure. Rostislav, hello. The central bank and Elvira Nabiulina are already drinking every possible sedative that the Russian Federation has. Decides to double sales of yuan from reserves, to keep the ruble from collapsing. Economists, including Russian ones, believe that the ruble's dependence on export volumes will not help. It is like being dead in the park. The actions of Elvira Nabiulina and the central bank are useless. Meanwhile, friendly countries, including Turkey, Egypt, and Iran, have started canceling vegetable and fruit shipments to Russia because of the falling ruble. The ruble continues to fall, and its rate on the markets for the day reached almost 110 rubles per dollar and 114 rubles per euro. Rostislav, in your estimation, could the collapse of the ruble lead to the fall of Putin's power, or at least to a loss of faith in its might and strength that he has been trying to demonstrate? Is this already the moment when the refrigerator will start beating the TV, or is it still early? The fact is that Putin actually doomed the country to such economic consequences back in February 2022. Because, of course, it was clear to reasonable people that he would not take Kiev in 3 days, that Ukraine would not surrender, and that the Western world would not leave it alone against this madman. In general, this is what happened. Another thing is that Russia held out a little longer than it could have, thanks to the fact that the sanctions were imposed rather sluggishly and cynically. When it was profitable, they were not noticed, such as when tankers were very actively traveling to India under the flags of countries such as Gabon or Belize, when in fact it was Russian oil refined in India and then shipped to the United States, where it was bought by the Americans. And, as the joke goes, who gave Putin the money for the war? Yes, in fact, America did, for many years. But when the next round of sanctions came, including those against Putin's shadow fleet, I said then that the ruble could fall to 120, and lo and behold, it was like seeing water. Although I am not an economist, it was clear even without special knowledge. When the political resolve finally showed up and hit Putin, the ruble, as I predicted, began to fall, because it is in fact no longer supported by anything but Putin's peanuts and sluggish oil trade. Those plans came true, and unfortunately Nabiulina held the situation a little longer than it would have collapsed, because if she had been replaced by other economists who were more loyal, The process could have started much earlier. Elvira Sahibzadna, an intelligent person, originally from Ufa, like me from Bashkortostan, has been left behind to work, and it is very sad. She serves this scoundrel, although she has always been considered a good and intelligent person. And her talents too, unfortunately, held the situation back a bit. But now I want to add a few perhaps minor details. She had 2 deputies, her closest friends, leave. One of them, Yudayeva, has left to work at the IMF, and the other, I'm sorry, I forgot her last name, but it's easy to Google, has also left, but not to some new place. This is a signal that they realize that there will be a catastrophe. Everything is about to go down, and they don't want to be responsible for hyperinflation and the collapse of entire sectors of the Russian economy. And the Russian economy. Has already started to fall by sector. For example, construction. Today in Russia, mortgages are completely up, which means that the entire construction sector has frozen, and this is the end. Today, even Putin's economic media recognize this. I watch the news with a sense of deep satisfaction. Like in the Soviet Union. RBC was watching, so there were predictions that that was it. The construction industry was bye-bye, and that today prices for new buildings in Russia would fall by half. That is, by times. It was said verbatim. You can imagine what it is for the construction industry, a drop in times. That is, of course, there is a margin in construction, there are no questions. But it is not 200, not 300%. It is not heroin, but apartments. So actually, when there is such a dramatic fall, it means that that's it. Now it's just going to start standing. What is the construction industry? The construction industry is a key driver of the economy in most countries, except maybe the Arab Emirates. We have all been waiting for the collapse we have been talking about, but only Putin has not realized it. The evening is drawing near, and we will soon see the real picture. You seem to be reading my mind, Rostislav. I wanted to continue that. I don't know what state the Russian dictator is in now, but as always, when problems arise, he does what he does best. He hides. This time his bottom is Kazakhstan. I don't know if Kazakhstan will breach it, but he tried his best to do so until it did. Apparently, Putin went there to hide. He just hasn't been told yet that everything's really going to hell. His money is going to his wife, by the way. Putin's lackeys are very afraid to tell him bad news. You know, when there were all these situations with successful counteroffensives of Ukrainian troops, they almost threw a coin, because everyone realized that a man aging in power is a monster. This is not a person. This is a disgusting, horrible person. Because power, as you know, corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This absolutely depraved man will not admit he is wrong. When someone comes to him now and tells him that, "Dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, our economy has collapsed," to put it mildly, what do you think he will say? Do you think he will say, "Oh, what an idiot I am for starting a war with the nearest country. Why did I ruin relations with the world, turn Russia into a pariah country, and bring all these sanctions on myself? Ah, what an idiot I am," and give himself a slap on the wrist with the palm of his hand? No, he will say that Nabiulina will change, put some lackey in her place who will be instantly slipped to him by other people who really need this post. Because to her, you have to give her credit. She kept the financial market very strong, and in particular prevented bankers from stealing. And among Putin's lackeys, half of them are thieving bankers, you know? They've been doing it all their lives. Now they are likely to put some young man with a burning eye in a key position. He will try to save the financial system, but at the same time, he will immediately give preferential treatment to banks close to the government, which will only exacerbate the financial crisis and increase the outflow of capital. Everything else will be in a fever, and there will be no money from where to get it. The main thing is Trump's plans, which he will start implementing as soon as he gets there. The market is ready, and Trump has promised his electorate to negotiate with the Arabs to lower oil prices, which he will definitely do. In America, it's impossible not to keep promises to the electorate. Even if you're Trump, you get punished quickly for it. Accordingly, plus, it will not be enough to dramatically reduce the revenues of Putin's oil industry. But at the same time, he said that he would bring production back to America, rein in China, and raise duties on China. And that, of course, is Trumponomics, what some experts call it. It's pretty funny stuff, but no good outcome for America, really. While America is setting up production, there will be a crisis in the country. China produces goods quickly, cheaply, and with quality, while the U.S. has a long history of producing only ideas. Trump, being old, doesn't realize that ideas sell better than the socks and underpants China produces for the American market. Actually, he will do it for sure, because he also promised to his, then, resident of Damphakistan, that's the name of that country in the middle of America, who is voting for Trump. Here is this. Damphakistan will demand that China be reined in, and that will likely trigger an economic crisis. When you have a crisis, stagnation, oil prices do what? They keep falling, and if they fall to $40, $50 a barrel, it will eat up all the profitability of the Russian oil industry. Russian oil oligarchs, starting with Sechin, have plundered the industry so that the cost of oil in Russia is twice what it should be. The Soviet Union collapsed at $20 a barrel, not because of the war in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, dictators are forgiven for such things. Russia will collapse at a price of $40 per barrel because the cost of oil production is $40 to $50. This means that even with oil sales, there will not be enough money for war and other needs. The question of time is which of the oligarchs will be the first to realize this. If they don't do it, everyone will sit in The Hague in a row and actually point fingers at each other. No, it's not me, it's him. Rostislav, I believe they have organized a whole flash mob of victory, with tough nuts wearing t-shirts. And Russian telegraph channels say that just after Russia's use of the hazelnut system, escalating conflict with the West, as they call it, although the West, of course, did not start a war against Putin, but Putin has a different opinion. The FSB has received a signal that an assassination attempt on Putin is being prepared. Most likely he wants to be killed by certain members of the Russian elites who are afraid of nuclear war, or just a big conflict with NATO. The main threat to Putin's life ФСБ получила сигнал о подготовке покушения на Путина. Скорее всего, его хотят убить отдельные представители российских элит, которые испугались ядерной войны либо просто большого конфликта с НАТО. Obviously comes from such internal enemies. Who could it be that Putin is afraid of? Why hasn't he convinced in so many years of his war, the 11th year, of only fighting against us, that it is so vital to fight NATO, which has never attacked, really, anyone? Who has he not convinced of those around him that this life is necessary? Because unfortunately, there are some not stupid people out there. I know many of them. And what is even coming out now, look at Deripaska's statements. These statements are just that. Look at the nearest state. You realize that the whole reason is him. And you realize that as soon as you wring his neck, everything will improve dramatically. But it is clear that you will have to pay for everything that Putin has done, even if Putin is dead. But one way or another, it has to end urgently, because otherwise, Russia will be in a hole for decades. And then all these great achievements of all these Deripaskas who spent their whole lives walking over the smoking bodies of their partners to their heights, it was all very important for them, you know?
Платить за все сделанное Путину придется, даже если Путин будет мертв, но так или иначе все равно заканчивать это надо срочно, потому что иначе Россия попадет в яму на десятилетия, и значит тогда все эти великие достижения всех этих дерипасок, которые, значит, всю жизнь шли по дымящимся телам компаньонов к этим вот высотам своим, это все, значит, было зря.
Because this man, from Putin's upper circle, he can no longer fly a normal airplane. He can't sail on a yacht less than 100 meters long. You know? Well, it's indecent, it's horrible, it's depressing. He can't eat properly if he lives like that. Or if there is even a threat of such a situation, then it is a terrible situation when you have to sail on a 99-meter yacht. Could this man kill another man? Of course, given his past and how he got to the top. In Russia, half the government has been privatized by oligarchs, and information on movements is always available to thousands of people. Putin is vulnerable to his inner circle, whom he tells a lot of things to, and who control him.
Путин абсолютно уязвим перед теми, с кем он работает. Путин уязвим перед этим вот своим ближним кругом, которому он, значит, много чего рассказывает и который много чем управляет.
Putin is vulnerable because of excessive bureaucracy and a plethora of darlings in every department, including the 3,000 people in his administration. Can you imagine 3,000 people, hundreds of them possessing such secrets that could escort Putin somewhere in the next world quite easily? As usual, such a dictator. So something like a man-portable air defense system hit the plane, and then they said that a flock of ducks flew into the plane. And it was unfortunate, it was nobody's fault. Well, the chief died, we're sorry.
Зачитает скорбно Катя Андреева, значит, это сообщение. Ну и все, собственно говоря, тут все остальные моментально побегут во главе там с тем, кто на тот момент будет премьер-министром.
Everyone will immediately run to the West, led by the Prime Minister, to make peace without waiting for the new president to be sworn in. This situation is quite obvious, and I can see it even without my glasses. We are talking about the collective Putin and his entourage. So the elimination of this biggest number one terrorist entity in the world would really change things very dramatically with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war or not. Of course, everything rests on Putin personally. Because yes, of course, there were people who brought him shells, brought him ideas. The same great genius, Vladislav Yuryevich Surkov. I used to know him and was even in contact with him for a while until I realized that he is not a progressive, not a liberal, but just a weather vane, someone who follows the direction that is set today, which is necessary to survive and continue driving around Moscow in a BMW 7 and sniffing various substances from the mirror, which I think is provided in the modern cars of oligarchs. So all these people, they wouldn't have organized it themselves. They would probably do some crap. They would steal a lot. But, the thing is, to turn from a thief into a murderer, as someone once said about Putin's government, you have to have an absolutely inconceivable amount of money. And not everyone has this inconceivable amount. Who among these oligarchs has it? Any oligarch out there, dig in, and Russia has been economically unstable for years because of Putin's antics. So every one of these oligarchs is chafing at the thought of not becoming a beggar. Look at Friedman's lamentations about how he can't hire a driver in London and does his own laundry because everyone is not immune from jail and prison. I don't see a situation where oligarchs without Putin will decide to continue the war instead of making money and seeking forgiveness from the West. That said, I am not excusing these people, Surkov, Mishustin, Friedman, and others who obeyed and hoodwinked. They are all guilty and should be held accountable. I'm sure they will immediately start reeling back and haggling for forgiveness so they don't go to jail and have their money taken away. This is a good prospect for the world because it's hard to pull off such a big thing on the battlefield because there are still some of these stocks from Soviet times.
Потому что сегодня на поле боя понятно, что очень тяжело сковырнуть эту огромную махину. Все-таки она большая. Все-таки с совковых времен еще вот эти все же орешки там валяются на складах.
Mikhail Podolyak talked about it, and I agree with him, because if they had not kept quiet about the production of supernova weapons, they would have told and shown cartoons long ago. And accordingly, all of this will lead to all of these Putin's great, awful ones shaking and trembling.
Эти вот все путинские великие и ужасные, они все будут трясущимися и дрожащими, и, собственно, вот в этом перспектива. Сегодня на поле боя раз вот так, значит...
That's the perspective. Today on the battlefield, it is important to be more cunning, to reach out to those circles that have approaches there, to talk to some Russians who can convince numerous other Russians of something. Yes, it is important today. We need to do serious work inside Russia, including ideological work, probably not for open conversations, but for some other cases. Rostislav, so does Putin have a plan B if everything is collapsing in and around him, or does he just know to fly to Kazakhstan? Since no one really brings bad news, Putin never has long-term plans. As my friend and colleague Stas Dilkovsky aptly noted, Putin is a tactician. He has no strategy because he is unable to calculate several steps ahead. Putin is a C student. I'm adding this on my own behalf. A man who did not study well, who did not get a higher education because his entire law school, where he had already been bought by the KGB, was just a sinecure for his work. For snitching on other students and other heroic Secret Service activities. This man is incapable. What the hell is Plan B? Look at his Plan A when he announced that he would start bombing Ukraine. My eyes went wide, and I thought, what will he achieve by this? How do you achieve denazification with bombs? How can you demilitarize a country if you attack it and the whole world stands behind it and promises help? Where's the logic in that? Don't overestimate Putin. He's stupid and a bit dodgy, especially in front of his own people, whom he first drives into a concentration camp and then punishes for the slightest objection. Slowly, everyone swallowed one thing after another, and now they are in this servile state before him. This is the only place where his cunning still works. And the rest of the world, look how the rest of the world reacted to his nuts. The whole world, seriously, was frightened only by the ruble, and the rest, the whole world, shrugged its shoulders and said, What Hazel? What did he decide to scare us with? What attack on the UK and the US? It's all absolute nonsense. It's excluded. It's impossible. He's going to lose to the Western world. And you go ahead and tell me exactly whether there will be a nuclear attack or not, whether I should change the tires on my car or not, whether I should do the tushka. That's what I saw everyone. And that's the moment when truckers are yelling about nukes. I had my whole Instagram full of pictures from my friends of how Moscow is trashed. I took one of these pictures that I now have behind me from one of my Ukrainian friends who posted this. Even though Putin is trying to intimidate you, it's time to realize that Ukraine is not going to be scared.
Значит, у меня весь Инстаграм в картинках от друзей, как, значит, Москва раздолбана. Я где взял одну из этих своих фотографий, которые сейчас у меня за спиной? Это вот как раз одного из украинских друзей, которые это постили, несмотря на то, что Путин там вас пытается запугивать. Да уже давно пора понять, да не испугается Украина.
The Ukrainians had won, the Russians were tired. We laughed at the Hazel, at its configurations and modifications, but not at the new missile, but at the new mockery that was going around on social networks. In Bashkortostan, Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat security guards tried to shoot down an An-2, mistaking it for a Ukrainian drone. Panic and consternation speak for the mood in Bashkortostan and other regions of Russia. I remembered flying a small airplane in the same place. Small aviation is developed there. Enthusiasts teach flying for pennies. I think it was an ordinary flight, not a drone, although there are conspiracies that Budanov allegedly launched it over Salavat.
Там хорошо развита вот эта малая авиация, там есть такие энтузиасты, которые где-то накупили какой-то рухляди и вот учат людей летать там за какие-то копейки, там, знаете, доступно абсолютно любому, кто там зарабатывает небольшие деньги. Значит, я думаю, что это был какой-то такой полет, я думаю, что это не было никаким дроном, там до сих пор конспирологии, что это якобы все-таки Буданов там запулил по Салават нефтеоргсинтезу, есть там такое огромное предприятие нефтехимическое, но думаю, что это вот, скорее всего, кто-то там, так же, как я, куда-то летел, да?
There is a petrochemical plant, but it was probably a routine flight. You have to be careful now, because Russia still doesn't realize the war. How do you comment on that? Cynically speaking, they could not even shoot down an An-2, although they are guarding a key petrochemical plant. It is gigantic, with underground reservoirs created by underground nuclear explosions. If the guards are so weak, it means that they simply stole money for air defense and did not put anything in place. Kirill Alexeyevich, if you hear this, God help us, our special services, yes, and realize your words, I think, heard. Rostislav, by the way, it is noteworthy that today there was an attack on Crimea. We, too, are already pining for Crimea, temporarily occupied by the Russian dictator. They were there screaming that everything was flying, Storm Shadow was flying, Neptune was flying, drones were flying. But the problem is different. When ATAC MS and Storm Shadow flew, it was a decision to hit the territory of the Russian Federation. Putin, who illegally wrote Crimea and 4 of our regions into his constitution, which really hasn't rubbed off, except I don't know in what places, didn't say anything.
Да, спасибо вам, кстати, за эту позицию и за эту деятельность. Была атака, кстати говоря, на Крым, мы тоже уже заскучали, временно оккупированный российским диктатором. Они там кричали, что летит все, и что Shadows летит, Нептуны летят, С-200 летит, дроны летят. Но примечательно другое, что когда летели атакамсы и Storm Shadows еще то раз решили...
And now, as they fly around the Kursk and Bryansk regions, he is somehow nervous. Does he realize that these territories have never been his and never will be? I think there is an understanding in his entourage. Putin may think of these regions as his own, but no one in the world, not even his allies, recognizes Crimea or the other 4 territories as Russian. So, of course they are doing their best, but they still take into account the tradition of international diplomacy, because, from the point of view of international diplomacy, this is absolutely not Russia, and they realize that. Rostislav, another point that points to possible preparations. The State Duma has approved the law on secret government work during martial law. Will Putin really go for martial law? It's not like he's waging a full-fledged war, although there has long been a war on his territory, in fact. But what are they taking? You know, he may try to do it at some point, but all these Sybarites, all these lovers of sweet wines and non-capricious women, people and men too, who are sitting in these white houses of his, will never work under martial law. They are not patriots and are not ready to die for Putin. They would rather quietly turn his head off and send it to Kiev in a parcel with a note. Sorry, Vladimir Alexandrovich. Rostislav, thank you so much for this conversation, for the facts and humor. Thank you for your position and your time. See you again. Have a nice day. Humor should definitely be kept. Happily, that's what we're doing. Bye. See you later. Rostislav Mirzagulov, writer, publicist, and social activist. Friends, thank you for your time, for listening. Leave your comments, subscribe to Channel 24's YouTube channel. Take care. We believe in the armed forces of Ukraine. See you. We will win.